Good evening all and welcome. Tonight we're going to be taking a trip into the haunted woods with a collection of 10 scary stories that I'm sure will leave you terrified. But for now it's time to get comfortable, grab your snacks, and let the darkness take control. My ex-father-in-law, Pedro, grew up working ranches. He told me this story, and that it happened to him in the 80s. Somewhere down in Frio County, along Highway 57, the road to Eagles Pass, he took a job with a ranch owner. He was given a mobile home to stay, and his family was welcomed to stay also. The ranch owner, Ferguson, I think is what they called him, had built himself a home several miles away on the same property. For the ranch hand, a site-built home was partially started but never completed. It was 3 sides of cinder block and a partial roof. This is why the mobile home was there. The land is about 100 miles from the US-Mexico border, and there have always been a lot of illegal immigrants crossing this land. One late afternoon, there were several illegals crossing the ranch property, when Pedro sees them and yells at them, asking what the hell they're doing crossing. They all stop and say, "Sir, we want no trouble. We're trying to get north for work and we're looking for a place to stay for the night." Pedro says, "Look at that home over there. You can camp there tonight, but need to be gone early because the owner will be up and doing his rounds. It should be enough cover for the night. If he sees you, I'll act like I don't know you." They agreed and set up camp in the non-completed house. So Pedro couldn't sleep well knowing he may be getting in trouble. He woke up extra early to wake the illegals up to tell them they needed to go. But none of them were in the house. He looked around and found that they had all moved their camp about 50 feet from the mobile home. He woke them and asked them why they moved. One of them started to say, "No, sir, we meant no trouble, but no one can stay in that area. We all heard voices screaming for help. It was bad." They left soon after and nothing was talked about again, until years later. Both Pedro and Ferguson had gotten older. By now they were pretty close, and sat out one night in the ranch drinking beer. Pedro tells him, "You know, one night these illegals came through and asked to stay the night. I told them they could stay in the old house, but they didn't." Pedro told Ferguson the whole story. Ferguson sat there a while. He finally said, "You know, after all these years I never told you. When I was young, I saw my grandfather work this ranch, and a handful of times I saw him catch some illegals himself. He killed them and buried them right there. He starts to build that home right over the bodies, but not even the contractors could finish it. They heard the same thing." This happened when I was around 8 years old. I grew up in the Midwest, Ohio to be more specific. The town or village was not large by any means, with around 40 to 50 people at most. During this time, my family didn't have the internet or cable TV, and cell phones were just starting to become mainstream. And as such, entertainment was mostly chores or roaming the surrounding area exploring. My house was backed by fairly dense woods. There was a steep decline with a massive, relatively flat wooded area where a creek ran through. This creek wasn't very deep, waist deep in certain areas, but mostly knee or ankle deep, but it was wide. Growing up, I lived in these woods, hiking up and down the creek, mapping the woods, exploring a few long abandoned and collapsed houses that nature reclaimed. I lived and breathed nature, and those woods were my home away from home. My father grew up in that area. My aunt, uncle, and cousins lived just next door to it. It was a pretty close-knit community. Naturally, everyone has ghost stories about their hometown, a haunted house, a tragedy of some sort that remains a stain on its history. My village was no different. My father would always tell stories about ghosts or abnormal happenings he experienced in his youth. One thing he would always tell me, when I told him that I was going into the woods was, "The trees may not walk about or talk, but they see, and they remember. I always thought of that as him saying, "Don't be stupid out there." My first encounter with people of the woods, which is what I've always called them, was when I was out on one of my daily excursions into the wild green. It was mid-July, hot and humid, and I stuck mostly to the creek as it was cool, and I didn't have to battle my way through thick undergrowth. I hiked approximately about 2 miles along the creek, hunting for crawdads or crawfish, and looking for signs of deer, rabbit, or the fabled albino squirrel. I kept traveling and eventually reached a relatively open field that had waist-high grass. I frequently stopped here to gather wild blackberries, rest, and spook the few white-tailed deer that bobbed in the area. But that day was different. As I drew closer to the field, I noticed someone standing there. Instinctively, I slowed down, lowered my posture, and tried to minimize my noise. I wasn't used to seeing someone out this far into the woods. The nearest house to that location was about 1.5 miles through thick undergrowth and fairly steep ravines to climb. As I hugged the bank of the creek, I moved to the edge of the open field, slowly peeking up over the tall grass to see if they were still there. But there was nothing. I thought that perhaps they had seen or heard me trudging through the creek and instinctively ducked too. I wasn't about to find out, so I turned around and headed back home, all 2.5 miles back. I was more aware of my surroundings and far more cautious of my sound as I moved, avoiding walking in the creek to prevent the sloshing of water to give me away. As I crept through the branches jutting out into the bank of the creek, I made my way to another area I was familiar with. A small game trail ran through here, and it would cut my time and distance back home a good bit. The only downside was it was pretty overgrown to either side, and portions had thick thorn bushes. The entire time I trekked back, I felt as if I was being watched. I never felt in danger or vulnerable of being attacked, but I could feel eyes on me. I was uneasy the entire time I followed the game trail, routinely stopping and listening to determine if I could hear footsteps or if I was being followed. Still nothing. I made it about halfway home when I saw in the corner of my eye a figure standing a short distance away. But as I moved my eyes in the direction of the figure, they seemed to just melt into the foliage. I thought maybe it was my paranoia, and it was making me see things, so I just carried on. A few 100 feet more, I again see another figure, this time further away out of my peripheral, and again as I looked in that direction, they'd meld back into the background. But this time it happened twice. As I looked, and the figure disappeared, another appeared again in my peripheral, closer but still a ways away. The entire time I never felt to be in danger. Creeped out, yes, but I never felt like whatever was there was nefarious. This continued on for the remainder of my time making my way back home, but the more it happened, the less I felt afraid of the figure, even going as far as saying out loud, "I know you're there. I don't know what you want, but I'm not here to cause trouble." Eventually I made it to my backyard and turned around to face the woods to see if they were there, but I saw nothing. My father was next to his shed, burning some cut grass in the backyard. I walked over to tell him what I had experienced, and before I could say a word, he looked at me with a slight grin and said, "I see you saw them too." I guess I had the look of terror written on my face. Without even missing a beat, he put down the hoe he was using to stoke the fire, walked past me to the wood line, and pulled out the can of dip he had from his pocket. He opened it, took a pinch out and placed it on a stone that was just sitting there, and then walked out. I asked him why he did that, and he said he gave them an offering. He began explaining what he meant by the trees see and remember, that it was important that we respect nature whenever we enter her domain, and give an offering in return when we take something from her. Otherwise, she may just not let us back out. He gave me the can of dip, and said what I saw were what he believed to be the spirits of Native Americans watching over their former land. I didn't really know what they were at the time, but I followed suit with what my dad did whenever I made my way back into the woods. I always left an offering. Although I still did see them from time to time, I never felt like I was in danger, and I always made sure to respect them. If they appeared in my peripherals, I would travel in the opposite direction. Apologies for any transgressions. The cousins and many people in my village were all aware of their existence, and just kind of gave them a wide berth whenever they appeared. I was oblivious to their existence, but when I learned of them and experienced them, a whole lot of people opened up about them, about some of the history of the town, and it was certainly an enlightening experience. I'm a teenager, and I've been in scouting/Boy Scouts for nearly all my life, and I really enjoy exploring with my friends and being trusted more, as I'm older now. A few years ago, me and two girls named Amy and Harriet were asked to head into the woods surrounding our campsite to find a long, straight stick, suitable for carving into a point. Bear in mind I was a lot younger back then. Harriet was older, and Amy was only a year older than myself. We had been deliberately walking in the same direction as to not get lost, and memorizing the surroundings as we went, in order for us to find our way back easily. About 15 minutes in, we couldn't find anything to take back, so we turned around and returned to the campsite. That's when the initial panic set in. The trees had almost unnaturally knitted themselves together in such a way that it seemed our path was non-existent in the first place, like it had just vanished. We looked around 360 degrees, and now everything looked exactly the same. Trees we could have sworn were different from each other appeared as all copies of the same tree. We kept walking in what we thought to be the right direction, while shouting for help, and eventually came to a concrete path, almost like a road but very thin, separating the forest and splitting it in two. We didn't follow the road as it went in the wrong direction to our campsite. On the other side of the path was more forest. However, nearby was an abandoned shack, likely used for storage. We had no idea anything like this was out here in these woods, so we just kept walking. Eventually, we came to a road we didn't recognize, and a woman wearing pink and purple walked past us as we frantically asked her for the direction of our campsite, as by now, according to our watches and Harriet's phone, we'd been walking for an hour and a half. She said she'd never heard of the campsite, but there is one in that direction. We followed her advice and eventually returned to our campsite. We frantically apologized for taking so long and that we couldn't find anything. The leader, Ian, could see all three of us were shaken up and stated confusedly that we'd only been gone about 25 minutes and that our free time was still going on. To this day, it baffles all of us, as our free time was 40 minutes long, and our watches and phone had said we'd been gone for several hours. The forest we were lost in felt crushing and claustrophobic, like we had entered an area that the concept of time did not apply to. I believe in the paranormal, but this was unlike anything I'd ever heard or experienced before. And the hours in the forest were only minutes in the real world. The feeling was very strange, and it stuck with me for the rest of camp. It's a weird but true tale, and I only wish I had an explanation. I don't really believe in the paranormal, but it still fascinates me. I keep an open mind even if my default is apprehension or disbelief, because I like the idea that extraordinary things can happen to people. It's interesting if that makes sense. However, there is one scenario that happened to me that I still cannot explain to this day. This happened some years ago. I went to visit a friend some 4 to 5 hours away. I was about 21 or 22. This was my first time traveling to visit friends at the distance. I'd never even taken a train before. My friend used to live in my city, but his family moved when we were younger, still kept in touch. He'd visit sometimes, and this was the first time I'd visit him. His family lives in a much smaller town, and it was also fairly rural. Behind his house was an area of untamed wilderness. I'll call it a forest for clarity, even if it probably didn't classify as one. Just lots of trees and brush, left unmaintained, and to nature. It was their house. Then 30 to 40 feet of chicken wire fence, and a further 250 to 300 feet is where you started entering the forest. My friend and his siblings alleged if you left a belonging on the side of the fence, not necessarily in the forest, it would be returned to you sometime later. I love it. Super cryptic and of low stakes. I'll run with this story for now. The first night I was there, I threw a hat I brought across the fence, and a few hours later my friend told me he found it on his porch. It didn't seem like proof of anything to me. I assumed he was just messing with me. I tried again the same night, monitoring my friend in the process, and when he went out to have a cigarette, I found the hat on the porch. Whatever. One of his siblings could have been in on the prank. The second night, unbeknownst to my friend, I took a belt buckle of his and threw it as far as I could across the fence, and again it suffered the exact same fate, on their front porch just a few hours later. I still wasn't super convinced. Maybe someone saw me and quickly went looking. At this point I started to get creeped out, but my disbelief still prevailed. On the third night we decided to go into the forest. It was me, my friend, and my friend's friend. We climbed over the fence and started walking across it towards the forest, and get about 50 feet deep when all of our flashlights went off in unison. My friend yelled for us to go back, and I didn't question it. We ran. But in the process I dropped my hat. I was fidgeting with it as we walked. When we got back into the house, my hat was inside, in their basement, in my suitcase zipped up. This shook me greatly, because my friend already had a sizable head start versus me. When we ran all the way back, there's no way he could have gone back to pick up the hat. I was with him when we all reached the house. Compounding this, we ran a straight line back to the house. There's no way someone could have grabbed it and ran a different route to beat us home. And on top of it all, we lock the house before we embark on our nightly walks. And it wasn't a duplicate hat either, unless they managed to replicate the wear and tear of my hat to a T. We didn't talk about it. I was done with it, and wanted nothing more to do with the forest. We all just basically said, "Oh, this just happened," and then dropped it completely. I left my hat with him when I left for home, half hoping and half dreading it would find its way back to me, but it never did. My friend and I kind of fell out of favor with each other for unrelated reasons shortly after this. If we ever reconcile, and it's been years since, I would want to talk to him about this and maybe even visit again. Their stories of occurrences in this forest are numerous, and if it's just for my curiosity, I would love to explore this more. My 6th grade band was going to a competition. One half of the band was in one car, and I and 3 others were in the intern's truck. My mum was a chaperone and was driving alone. I had to leave to visit my grandparents straight from the competition instead of driving a few hours home first. Anyway, the car with the other part of the band was already at the hotel hanging out in the lobby. My truck and my mum were driving right next to each other on the way to the hotel. The GPS took us both on one of those back roads that's not really on any maps. Extremely old 2-lane roads in the middle of the woods with trees growing inwards into the road. As soon as we got on the road, I got a very eerie vibe, and I think everyone else in the truck did too. After driving on it for a bit, we reached this very old bridge and had to slow down to go over it. As we went over it, me and my friend looked behind our car, and both of us swear we saw my mum's car right behind us, headlights on, correct brand, model, car color, etc. It was dark, so we couldn't see inside of it. After driving on this road for about 15 minutes, we pulled out from the road and we were right next to the hotel. My mum had already been there for 10 minutes. By the way, the other car had never passed us, so she couldn't have just sped ahead of us. My mum had been behind us when we were on that road. I have no idea what happened there, but the rest of the night just went on as normal. 7 years ago, my wife and I purchased a property and 11 acres of woods in a rural part of northeastern Minnesota. The woods were connected to a large acreage of fields and woods about 160 acres, and although sparsely populated, the land is near a fairly busy state highway. There are some housing developments in the area, but they are 3 to 4 miles away, and the majority of land around our property are farm fields, woods and rivers. It's remote, but with towns so close I wouldn't call it wild by any means. I'm mentioning this because I've heard of many Native American legends of things in the deep northern woods of Minnesota and Canada, but the area in which we live is not that. Rural, yes, but not the endless north woods. I would like to say I'm not a believer in the supernatural, and have never been afraid of the woods or the outdoors, even though I have a healthy sense to caution and respect it because of large bears, moose, wolves, and other potentially dangerous wildlife. I am also an avid hunter and mountaineer, and have experienced many nights in the wilderness. I've had numerous encounters with dangerous animals or situations, so I'm not spooked easily. Knowing my state of mind is important to my story, because many so-called supernatural encounters can be explained by people with an already high level of belief, anxiety, or fear, which would not be my case. Well, that all changed after a few weeks after moving in. The house and land had been abandoned for a few years due to foreclosure, so a lot of work needed to be done to get it back in shape. Wildlife had grown accustomed to no human presence, and black bears frequently roamed the yard at night, along with many other woodland creatures. We also found a lot of animal bones scattered throughout the woods, and coyotes were abundant. One night during those first few weeks we had a rainstorm, and I was worried about a broken downspout potentially causing a basement leak. It was around 10 p.m., so I grabbed my headlamp and headed outside to deal with the situation. Behind our house is a fairly large swampy area that divides the woods. I had my back facing this area while fiddling with the downspout, when suddenly I had this intense feeling of dread. It's really hard to explain the feeling, but it was like my body knew something was back there. It was very unusual, based on the circumstances, never having felt this type of fear before. I tried to stay calm and slowly turned around to point my headlamp back towards the swamp. What I saw was something I still cannot explain. Eyes, numerous, glowing and reflecting, staring back at me. These were not eye reflections that you typically see with a deer or other animal, since they were at different heights, and when I pointed my headlamp spot beam directly at them, where you would expect a head to be, there was nothing but weeds and trees. When I turned the headlamp off, they were still there, and glowing as if light were being shined. They didn't move, they just stared through me. Needless to say at this, I bolted and ran as fast as I could back into the house and explained it away as a deer or raccoons. Later that summer, I was sitting out on our screened-in porch that partially faces the swamp and connected woods to the west. It was approximately 11 p.m. when I began to hear what sounded like a bear fighting with or attacking a cow. Since there was a small farm to the southwest of my property, I assumed that perhaps a cow had wandered into the woods and been attacked by a bear. I really didn't know if this was something a bear would actually do, but it was my only guess based on the sounds I was hearing at the time. It was clearly some kind of roar, like a bear, but then followed by a frantic-sounding cow mooing. This went on for over an hour, and it was perhaps one of the most horrible sounds I'd ever seen. Even though it sounded so strange and almost supernatural, it didn't frighten me since I had this rational explanation in my head. Even weirder, the same series of sounds happened again the next summer. These first few years I never investigated the area of the woods that the sounds came from, as it was not my property. A few years later I had the chance to purchase this area and 70 acres to the west, which consisted of the woods that connected to mine, as well as a few fields, more woods and ponds. As part of purchasing this land, I spent a great deal of time walking around it to get a good understanding of its value and layout. As part of my walk, I was able to get a much better look at the farm setup to the south. The farm did have cows, as I suspected, but to my surprise the area they were keeping in was a long distance from my house, much too far for me to hear them, and the fence was also extremely well built as well as electrified. Looking at it, there was no way a cow was wandering off that farm. I didn't really think about this fact until recently, but I feel it's best to explain things in chronological order. After acquiring the property, I proceeded to put up tree stands in various locations along with trail cameras in order to prepare for the upcoming deer hunting season. One spot was the hilly woods where I heard those sounds many years prior. Again, I did not connect these two things until now. The area was very odd, as whenever I hiked through there, I always saw some strange new thing. One time my son and I found an old game snare tied to a tree, with what looked like dried blood on the tree bark. Another time we found an at least 100-year-old tree with a barbed wire fence completely spiraling the tree trunk, growing in and out of it at different intervals. I've also found many tree trunks with very large scratches or claw marks, not resembling an antler rub, perhaps a bear. We'd almost always find dead animal bones in the area, and even this winter, I found a few deer legs snapped and picked clean. My sons have found numerous animal skulls there as well. As I was saying, I put a game camera in this year since I'd seen tracks and signs and wanted to get a sense of the best places to hunt. I've placed one out there many seasons and have yet to capture a single thing on it. Nothing. My son has posted there a few times for hunting season and has mentioned the strange sense of quiet. He's used to the forest sounds returning after sitting there for long periods of time, but in this spot there are never really any sounds. He has mentioned hearing something walking around though. Another incident occurred one hunting season when I was entering this area en route to another stand, when I saw a violent, thrashing thing in the foliage moving fast and crossing from left to right but moving away from my position. I of course encounter deer and bear all the time, so I am familiar with how they move when spooked, but this was something different. Whatever this thing was making a high-pitched trumpeting, combined with the bellowing sound that was like nothing I'd ever heard from an animal outside of an elk, which we didn't have in this area. It wasn't bounding, and there wasn't the raised white tail or large dark mass to indicate a bear or deer. There really didn't appear to be a body at all, just whipping and falling leaves and branches, along with deafening sounds. A year after this incident, my son went hiking out of the woods to try and find me since I was out doing some forest management. As he walked through this area, he thought he spotted me coming through the woods quickly, but soon noticed the walk and clothing were not like mine. Whoever it was a lot taller than me, and he described him as extremely thin. He said the person he saw did not notice him at all, and seemed to be walking in a straight line like they had tunnel vision. Seeing something in this part of the woods, and their direction of travel, didn't at all make sense, since there really would be no reason to be there or head out that far, as it leads to deep ravines and uncrossable rivers. After he found me and explained what he saw, I quickly went over to investigate to see if we had a trespasser. I hiked for quite a while but never found anything or anyone. If someone was there, They either got picked up on the road or vanished. That same year, my son had a friend over, and they went for a late afternoon walk in the woods. As it began to get dark, they made their way back by walking on the edge of the field that is next to this area of woods. As they passed by, they said they saw a figure a little ways off in the trees. Whatever they saw was near one of the hills in this patch of forest and seemed to be making some kind of hand gestures. It began walking slowly towards them when they called out, "Hey, hello?" He or it stopped still and said nothing. It was at this point the boys sensed something wasn't right and bolted back towards the house. They rushed into the house and told me what they saw, and I of course laughed it off as their mind playing tricks on them. My son described the figure as tall, about 10 to 15 feet, but with skinny arms, and his body was dark all over. Not hairy per se, but just dark. And even though it was an animal at first because of the weird way it looked, he couldn't really describe it very well other than gaunt or skinny and strangely dark. Me, being the curious and protective father that I am, was worried about it being trespassers, drug addicts, or both, so I told them I would go to take a look. They took me to the area and pointed to where it was standing, and I headed into the woods. Since it was winter, there was snow on the ground. I thought it would be easy to find the tracks of whatever this thing was to find out where it came from or went. When I go to the spot, there wasn't a single track or disturbance in the snow. There was no way an animal or man could have been here and not left any tracks. They had either made it up or their minds had played tricks on them, or so I thought. To this day, my son and his friend still swear they saw it clear as day, and I can definitely attest that their fright was real. My wife had also experienced this strange thrashing sounds and other feelings of dread or being watched in these parts of the woods, and generally refuses to go over there anymore. All of this brings me to today, where I had a sudden realization that all of the strange sounds, sightings, bones, and events seems to be centered around this one area, and I'm just at a complete loss for what it all means. It's all too strange to really bring this up and discuss with people I know around here, but I wanted to share this with you in the community, to see if you have any theories or ideas on what we may be dealing with. I'll continue to investigate on my end, but would love to get your feedback. My sister and I had just received a tent as a gift from our grandfather. He had smoked enough Marlboro cigarettes and sent in the UPC to get a massive Marlboro tent. My mum hated it. We, however, loved it and immediately set it up on the property line behind the house. We intended on spending the night out there, but after an hour or two, we experienced something neither of us can explain away to this day. We saw an indentation drag itself across the tent, and heard it dragging as well. It was like a giant finger or perhaps log, something of that size. My sister cried out and I immediately bolted outside, and I was convinced it would be our father playing a prank on us. Upon exiting the tent, however, I was greeted by something far more terrifying. Nothing. There was nothing there. I searched the area briefly before grabbing my sister and going inside. About a week later, I ventured out to the tent again, only to realize it was gone. I ran inside and asked my mother where it was, and she replied saying that she had thrown it away because it had tears in it. Confused, I tried to convince myself she was lying and had only thrown it out because she was anti-smoking and thought the tent looked trashy, but I feared that she was telling the truth. The second event happened one full morning, about an hour before my alarm went off for school. I was jolted out of bed by what I can only describe as an otherworldly shriek. It came from the woods. It didn't sound human, but didn't sound animal either. Foxes and coyotes live in the woods, but they don't make sounds like that, and I was fairly well versed in the sounds of the woods, having lived near here. There was also this one time, in the evening, my father and I were up late having one of our classic all-night arguments. As we finally wrapped up our night at 3 a.m., my father said he wanted to read a verse from the Bible in order to close on a positive note of peace. As he began to read out loud, the same, or at least very similar, otherworldly shriek boomed through the house. It had to have been just outside the kitchen window, but it was so loud that it sounded almost like it was in the house. We immediately ran around the house trying to find what the hell made such a sound, and it even awoke my siblings and mother, who helped search in the confusion. About a half hour later, we all sort of gave up and went to bed scratching our heads. Time passed, and in my senior year of high school I got a cat. She was an outdoor cat, but we would let her into the garage to sleep every night, mostly due to the coyotes and potential bad weather and whatnot. She would always come home before we shut the garage door, because if she did not, she would be locked out. One night she didn't show. I didn't think much of it, as cats can sometimes go on long hunting/mating excursions, only to return in 2 to 3 days like nothing happened. We assumed this was the case. After not seeing her for a solid week, I went and explored the area behind my house, the fields, and of course the woods. I think I found her. Because I honestly couldn't tell. It looked like her, but she had been seemingly turned inside out. I stared at the remains for about a minute before turning back home. I don't know what kind of animal would do that to my cat, but I think there might be something odd going on in the woods. One of my older brothers, when he was around 12, was walking through the forest with his best friend when something started throwing gravel stones at them from the tree line. They ran into the forest chasing after it with their flashlights but found no one. He's never been back since after dark. The same brother just a few months ago was dropping a friend off at my grandparents' house as he was driving by our old home, which lies across from the forest. A very old lady was slowly walking across the middle of the road, clutching something to her chest. He thinks she was holding a shawl. It was raining, cold, in the middle of the night, so he pulled over and asked if she needed any help. As soon as he did, she began yelling and screaming at him while sprinting straight for his open window, all while holding her arms to her chest. He promptly reversed the hell out of the Dodge. There have been multiple sightings of a ghost lady wandering around clutching her baby to her bosom. Legend has it that she lost sight of her child and he got lost. His body was found several days later, and to this day she holds him in her arms and yells at anyone trying to enter the forest at night. One particularly messed up story involves a guy that as early as 2016 was studying waterfowl and local birds, and followed some ducks off the beaten path and deep into the woods. His cell phone mysteriously died and wouldn't turn on. It was at that moment a lady came walking through the woods clutching something to her chest. He hid behind a tree and she wandered off. He followed her out of curiosity, as she was acting strangely and it was nearly dusk and raining on top of everything else. They were miles from the nearest trail, and as he followed her, he stumbled upon 3 tiny shed-like houses. As he did, his adrenaline jumped to 11, and he lost all sense of hearing. The lady was standing in the middle of the house, clutching something to her chest, smiling and flashing her teeth. His fight-or-flight instinct kicked in, and he ran all the way out of the forest for his life. The moment he got away from her, his phone turned back on with 85% battery left of its own accord. Could it have been the same woman my brother saw? Was she involved in turning off everyone's phones at the time? Come to think of it, the creeper was standing near the exact spot it happened when I saw it. Other locals have reported hearing inexplicable shrieking coming from various entrances of the woods at night. My girlfriend was driving to my grandparents' a few months back, and she herself saw a bunch of bunnies in a circle standing still as she drove by, in the exact spot my mother had years before. I moved to my current residence with my family a few years back. I was around 12 and excited to settle into a new place. The house was new when we moved in, and it was only 7 years old, and there were never any accidents in it or the large backyard. On the border of the backyard was a government-owned forest you could walk through with trails. Our house had a pathway that led down into the forest. Me and my brothers were excited to go there, so a few days after settling in, our dad took us out. The whole hike was normal until we started coming back through the access that was made by the previous owners. When I was going through, I took a wrong turn where the path split. We were near the exit to our property, but I came across a split and took a wrong path. I walked a short distance to where our property should have been, but it wasn't there. I looked forward and just saw a field of sunflowers. The field of sunflowers must have been a large one because I couldn't see the tree line behind it. The field didn't make sense. It was located around where the property would start and seemed to be massive. My dad realized I was gone and called me back. The times I went through the woods after, I couldn't see the split in the path. Somewhat recently, I went through the woods with my brothers, and I accidentally, without realizing it, went through the split and found an empty field with no sunflowers. Both occurrences, where I went through a split, took place in summer. It's just a bit weird. Was it real? This happened to me the other night in New Jersey. If you're sitting on my couch and you turn around about 15 to 20 feet away, there'll be a big sliding glass door which will lead you to my porch. If you go down the steps and walk around 50 feet, you'll be met with the pines or pine barrens. If you pay attention to urban legends, you may recognize these woods as the same woods the Jersey Devil lives in. That's the context. It was around 9 and I was sitting on the couch talking to 2 friends and just watching TV. We're having a good time when I realized that one of my friends is looking out back with a puzzled look on his face. I asked him what the matter was, and he says something along the lines of, "Nothing, I just thought I saw something in your backyard." So I turn around for a split second, and I see what appears to be 2 heads peering from around a tree, then immediately duck behind again. At this point, I'm like, holy crap, what is that? So my friend grabs a kitchen knife and runs out onto the porch, just yelling for whoever it is to leave. I run out and tell him it's fine and to go back inside. This time I see 3 heads, all closer than before, so I shout to get away and that I have a gun, but I'm bluffing. Then I see them dart behind the tree again, and they're gone. Still have no idea what that is, but I'd love some answers. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so very much for listening. I do hope that you enjoyed tonight's video. If of course you did, you can let me know in the usual way. I'd like to apologize about there being no video on the weekend. I just thought we needed a break, really. I've got a big one planned for this weekend, probably Saturday. And yeah, you'll see why, if you want to watch it. It's going to take a long time to make. I really like the Haunted Woods stories. Yeah, they were really fun. If you liked it too, you can let me know. I'd like to, as always, give a huge thanks to my members and patrons whose names are on screen. You guys really are the MVPs here. Thank you. I don't think I've got anything else to say. No updates, really. I'm just super grateful that you guys stuck around. Thank you for watching to the end of the video. But that's it from me. If you want to watch more, you can click the links on screen. But hopefully, I'll see you in a few days. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.